History usually celebrates great explorers, the ones who set out to conquer the world. But today, we're talking about the trips where the plan sounded brilliant, right up until reality showed up. This is where ambition met bad weather, terrible maps, and a few decisions that made future generations shake their heads. There was a whale that decided to sink a whaling ship, an expedition that brought a dining table into the desert like they were planning a dinner party, a man who tried to reach the North Pole in a balloon he could barely control, and a mountaineering team that cut their way out of a tent and ran straight into a blizzard. Welcome to 31 Doomed Expeditions. Story 1. The Franklin Expedition, a perfect plan, meets uncooperative weather. In 1845, the British Royal Navy sent 2 modern ships into the Arctic to search for the legendary sea route known as the Northwest Passage. More than 100 sailors set off with great confidence. On paper, this expedition looked almost impossible to fail. The ships were equipped with steam engines, thousands of canned food supplies, a small library for reading during long frozen days, and even a piano. The idea was simple: if they had to stay in the Arctic for a while, they might as well do it with a little style. But the Arctic did not care about their plans. Sea ice quickly trapped both ships. Time passed, winters dragged on, food slowly ran out. When archaeologists found the remains many years later, marks on the bones revealed the desperation those men had faced. And if you think the Arctic was harsh, the next story gets even stranger. Story 2. Dalton Pass. Mystery on a frozen mountain. In 1959, 9 Soviet students set out on a winter mountaineering trip in the Ural Mountains. They were experienced hikers, properly equipped and confident this would simply be a difficult but manageable expedition. But weeks later, the search team discovered a scene that made absolutely no sense. The group's tent was found on the slope, and it had been cut open from the inside, as if everyone had panicked and slashed their way out in the middle of the night. Footprints in the snow showed they left during a blizzard, some of them not even wearing shoes. Some were found dead from the cold, but others had severe internal injuries with almost no external wounds, and one victim was even missing their tongue. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened that night, but sometimes disasters don't come from mysteries. They come from a giant animal in the ocean. Story 3. The Essex Disaster. When the prey changes the rules. In 1820, the whaling ship Essex was doing what it normally did in the Pacific Ocean: find whales, hunt them, and bring whale oil back to sell. For the crew, it was just another routine day at sea, but then they encountered a massive sperm whale. And instead of swimming away like most whales do, this one seemed to have a different plan. It turned around, picked up speed, and rammed straight into the ship. Not once, but twice. The impact left the ship badly damaged and sinking in the middle of the ocean. The crew had to abandon it, climbing into small boats and drifting across the sea with very little food and water. What started as a normal hunting trip suddenly became a terrifying fight for survival. The prey had won, and the story later inspired the novel Moby Dick. But even the ocean wasn't as unforgiving as the place in the next story. Story 4. Scott in Antarctica, the race where he realized he came second. In 1912, British explorer Robert Falcon Scott led his team toward Antarctica with one clear goal: become the first people in history to reach the South Pole. After months of dragging sleds across ice, battling brutal winds and constant hunger, they finally approached their destination. Scott and his men took the final steps with huge hope. But when they arrived, something was already there, flapping in the freezing wind the Norwegian flag. Explorer Roald Amundsen had arrived before them by exactly 34 days. That moment must have felt like running a marathon your entire life, only to discover someone else had been standing at the finish line waiting for you. But the worst part was still ahead. From that moment on, Scott's journey back was no longer a race. It became a desperate fight for survival against the Antarctic ice. Story 5. Napoleon invades Russia. The trip where winter won the war. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led a massive army of about 600,000 soldiers into Russia. At the time, it was the largest military force Europe had ever seen. Napoleon's plan sounded simple enough: move fast, defeat the Russian army, and return home as a glorious victor. But the Russians had a different strategy. Instead of fighting head-on, they kept retreating deeper into their territory. Before leaving, they burned food supplies, homes, and anything that could support the French army. Napoleon marched into empty cities and blackened fields. Then the Russian winter arrived. The brutal cold, starvation, and disease began destroying what had once been considered an unstoppable army. By the end of the campaign, most of those 600,000 soldiers had vanished into the snow. But sometimes disasters don't begin with war. They start with an idea that sounded dangerous from the very beginning. Story 6. Andre's balloon. A bold idea flying straight into trouble. In the late 19th century, Swedish engineer Salomon Andre had an idea that sounded both brilliant and, slightly concerning, reach the North Pole by hot air balloon. Instead of walking or using ice-breaking ships like other explorers, he believed he could simply drift with the wind all the way to the top of the world. It sounded impressive. There was just one small detail: the balloon had almost no real way to steer. Once it lifted off, they were basically handing their fate over to the weather. At first, the flight looked promising, but that optimism didn't last long. After only 3 days, the balloon lost control and crashed onto the thick Arctic ice. The 3 explorers survived the crash, but they quickly realized something troubling. They were stranded in one of the most remote frozen places on Earth. And that was only the beginning of the longest walk of their lives. Story 7. Mawson in Antarctica, the expedition where nature almost won. In 1912, Australian explorer Douglas Mawson was leading a survey expedition in Antarctica with 2 teammates. The 3 men pulled sleds across endless white ice carrying food equipment and the hope that everything would go according to plan. But in Antarctica, plans usually last, only until nature decides otherwise. In one terrifying moment, one of Mawson's teammates slipped and fell into a deep crevasse. With him disappeared almost all of the group's food sled dogs and much of their survival equipment. Suddenly, the scientific expedition turned into a fight for survival. In the end, Mawson had to return to base alone, dragging his sled across hundreds of kilometers of frozen wilderness with almost nothing left to eat except what the brutal environment allowed. And if you think that was already insane, wait until the next expedition. Story 8. Soyuz 11, the return no one expected. In 1971, 3 Soviet cosmonauts carried out a historic mission aboard the space station Salyut 1. They lived and worked in space for several days, setting a record for the longest spaceflight at the time. Everything went smoothly, and when the mission ended, they began their journey back to Earth as heroes. The Soyuz capsule landed exactly as planned. Rescue teams rushed toward it, ready to welcome the 3 cosmonauts after their historic flight. From the outside, everything looked completely normal. But when they opened the hatch, the scene inside left everyone frozen in shock. The 3 cosmonauts were still sitting in their seats, but there were no signs of life. There had been no explosion, no major accident, just a terrifying silence. Later, investigators discovered the cause: a small valve in the capsule had opened unexpectedly, allowing the air to escape into space. Just one tiny detail, but enough to change history. Story 9. Burke and Wills, the expedition that brought a dining table into the desert. In 1862, British explorers Robert Burke and William Wills led an expedition with a very ambitious goal: cross the Australian continent from south to north. It was a long journey through harsh deserts that were barely explored at the time. To prepare, they brought a lot of equipment. And when we say a lot, we mean a lot. Wagons filled with scientific instruments, personal items, and even a large dining table. Because clearly in the middle of a scorching desert, the most important thing was maintaining proper dinner etiquette. There was just one small problem with this grand plan. They miscalculated the amount of food needed for the journey. As the expedition dragged on and the desert truly began to test them, all those luxurious items became completely useless, because the desert does not care about polite dinner manners. Story 10. The mystery of Mallory on Everest. Did they reach the summit? In 1924, 2 British climbers, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, set out to conquer Mount Everest. At that time, Everest was the highest mountain on Earth that no one had successfully climbed. Their equipment was quite simple by modern standards: thick wool clothing, basic ropes, and rather primitive oxygen tanks. On a windy, snowy climbing day, another member of the expedition looked through a telescope and spotted the 2 men high on the mountain slope. They were still moving well and appeared to be getting close to their goal. That was the last time anyone ever saw them alive. Soon after, thick clouds rolled in and covered the entire mountain, and the 2 climbers vanished into Everest's freezing mist. To this day, the mystery remains. No one knows whether Mallory and Irvine reached the summit of Everest or were only a few steps away when they disappeared. Story 11. Percy Fawcett, the explorer who disappeared in the Amazon. In 1925, British explorer Percy Fawcett entered the Amazon rainforest with a powerful belief. He was convinced that deep within the vast jungle existed a mysterious ancient city he called the City of Z. Fawcett was not an inexperienced dreamer. He had explored the Amazon many times before and always returned alive. But this time, he chose to travel with a very small team, only his son and a close friend. His idea was simple. A smaller group could move faster and attract less attention. At a place in the jungle known as Dead Horse Camp, Fawcett sent his final letter home to his family. After that, he and his team pushed deeper into the rainforest. And then, they vanished. No clear trail, no bodies, no certain explanation. The Amazon seemed to swallow them completely. To this day, the fate of Percy Fawcett remains one of the greatest exploration mysteries in history. Story 12. The Baltic Fleet. When a war fleet shot fishing boats. In 1904, Russia decided to send the Baltic Fleet halfway around the world to join the war against Japan. It was one of the longest and most stressful naval journeys of the time. Dozens of warships and thousands of sailors set off with a very clear mission: defeat the Japanese fleet. There was just one small problem. Japan was still thousands of kilometers away. While sailing through waters near Britain, Russian sailors began to panic because of rumors that Japanese torpedo boats were lurking in the darkness. In the middle of the night, they spotted several small ships at sea and immediately assumed they were Japanese warships. So they did what any nervous war fleet might do. They opened fire. The only issue was that those Japanese warships were actually British fishing boats. The incident nearly started a brand new war before the fleet had even reached its real enemy. Story 13. HMS Bounty. When the crew didn't want to leave paradise. In 1787, the ship HMS Bounty left England on a rather unusual mission sail to Tahiti, collect breadfruit plants and transport them to the Caribbean as a cheap food source for plantations. On paper, it sounded like a peaceful botanical expedition. After months at sea, the ship finally reached Tahiti. And that was when the real problem began. Tahiti at the time felt like paradise. Warm weather, fresh food, and a life far more comfortable than the strict discipline aboard a naval ship. The crew quickly got used to this relaxed lifestyle. So when Captain William Bligh ordered them to leave Tahiti and head back to the open ocean, not everyone was thrilled. Only 3 weeks after leaving the island, a group of sailors led by Fletcher Christian did the one thing every navy fears most. They mutinied, and Captain Bligh was set adrift at sea in a small boat. Story 14. The Narvaez Expedition. 600 men enter Florida, only 4 return. In 1527, Spanish conquistador Panfilo de Narvaez led around 600 men to the land we now know as Florida. Their goal was typical for that era: find gold, establish a colony, and return home as victorious conquerors. But from the very beginning, things started going wrong. The expedition quickly lost contact with its supply ships and had to push deep into swamps and dense forests they barely understood. Disease, starvation, and conflicts with local indigenous groups slowly weakened their force. When the situation became desperate, the survivors decided to build crude rafts and try to sail along the coast toward Mexico. It was a plan that already sounded dangerous. Sea storms soon destroyed most of the rafts. People died from hunger, illness, and exhaustion. In the end, out of the original 600 men, only 4 survived. Story 15. The Darien Scheme. When a colony bankrupted a nation. In the late 17th century, Scotland had a very ambitious idea: build a colony in Central America to control trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The colony was called Darien, located in what is now Panama. On paper, the plan sounded brilliant. If it worked, Scotland could become one of the world's richest trade hubs. People across Scotland invested heavily in the project. In fact, nearly a quarter of the nation's total wealth ended up tied to this single expedition. But when the settlers finally arrived, they discovered a harsh reality. The land was a humid jungle filled with diseased mosquitoes and soil that was nearly impossible to farm. Malaria and yellow fever quickly devastated the colony, and Spain was not exactly thrilled to see new neighbors settling in the area. Within just a few years, the colony collapsed completely, and Scotland was left nearly bankrupt. Story 16. The Lost Army of Cambyses. 50,000 men vanish in the desert. Around 524 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II decided to send a large army into the Sahara Desert. Their mission was to march to the Sia oasis and destroy a famous temple that the king believed had insulted him. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, about 50,000 soldiers began the march across the brutal desert. At first, everything seemed normal. The army moved deeper into an endless sea of sand in a world where compasses, maps, or GPS, of course, did not exist. Then something strange happened. A massive sandstorm was said to have swept across the desert and swallowed the entire army. When the storm passed, there was no trace of them left. No camp, no weapons, no bodies. They had simply vanished. For more than 2,000 years, archaeologists have searched for evidence of this lost army. But the Sahara Desert seems to have decided to keep that secret to itself. Story 17. The Karluk Disaster. When the captain left and never came back. In 1913, the ship Karluk led a Canadian Arctic expedition aimed at exploring unknown northern lands. The vessel and its crew pushed deep into icy waters where weather and sea ice could change quickly and unpredictably. Not long after, the ship became trapped in thick ice. As the situation grew dangerous, the expedition leader Nilambour Stephenson decided to leave the ship to go hunting on the ice. The plan was supposed to be a short trip, but he never returned. Meanwhile, the Karluk remained locked in the ice until the pressure crushed the hull and the ship sank beneath the frozen sea. The crew had no choice but to abandon it and survive on drifting Arctic ice. They were forced to travel hundreds of kilometers across the ice, facing brutal cold and a severe lack of food. By the time rescue finally arrived, many of them were no longer alive to return home. Story 18. The Belgic Expedition. When Antarctic darkness drove people nearly mad. In 1897, the Belgian ship Belgic sailed into Antarctica with a mission of scientific research and exploration of the frozen unknown. At first, everything went fairly well until the ship became trapped in thick sea ice. That meant the expedition had to spend the entire Antarctic winter right there. And winter in Antarctica is unlike anywhere else on Earth. For months, the sun never rose. There was only darkness, brutal cold, and complete isolation. Gradually, the crew began to change. Some fell into deep depression, others started experiencing hallucinations, and one man even believed the sea ice was alive and watching them. The atmosphere on the ship became so tense that almost everyone stood on the edge of psychological collapse. What began as a scientific expedition slowly turned into a harsh experiment on how much darkness the human mind can endure. Story 19. USS Jeannette. When the ice crushed the ship. In 1879, the USS Jeannette left San Francisco with an ambitious plan: reach the North Pole by sailing through the seas north of Siberia. At the time, some scientists believed that there might be an ice-free ocean near the pole. The idea sounded optimistic, but nature had other plans. Soon after entering the frozen waters, the ship became trapped in thick sea ice. Instead of moving forward, it was locked in place and drifted with the ice for nearly 2 years. The crew could do nothing but wait and hope the ice would eventually melt. But the opposite happened. The pressure from the ice kept increasing until the hull began to crack. Eventually, the ship was completely crushed and sank into the Arctic Ocean. The crew had no choice but to drag their boats and supplies across the ice, beginning a brutal survival journey through the frozen polar wilderness. Story 20. Maurice Wilson, the man who believed prayer could conquer Everest. In 1934, Maurice Wilson, a British war veteran, came up with an idea that made many people simply sigh. He believed that through fasting, prayer, and enough faith, a person could achieve anything. And to prove it, he decided he would climb Mount Everest. There was just one small detail. Wilson was not a professional climber and had almost no serious mountaineering experience. His plan was even stranger: fly a small airplane near Everest, land somewhere on the mountain, and then walk to the summit. British authorities quickly said no, but Wilson secretly traveled to Tibet and began his journey anyway. He attempted to climb Everest's slopes under brutal conditions almost entirely alone. In the end, his body was found inside his tent at about 7,000 meters above sea level. His faith was strong, but Everest was stronger. Story 21. Walter Raleigh, the hunt for the golden city of El Dorado. In the late 16th century, English explorer Sir Walter Raleigh became obsessed with a famous legend, the golden city of El Dorado, said to be hidden deep within the jungles of South America. If he could find it, he would become one of the richest and most famous men in Europe. Raleigh organized several expeditions into the dense and dangerous forests of the Amazon. He heard stories of cities filled with gold rivers, glittering with precious metal, and he believed that if he just went a little farther, he would finally find it. But El Dorado turned out to be like a dream that kept moving farther away the more you chased it. After years of unsuccessful searching, Raleigh returned to England empty-handed. Worse still, during a clash with the Spanish, his son was killed. In the end, Raleigh himself was arrested and executed. The Golden City was never found, but the search for it took almost everything from him. Story 22. The Coronado Expedition, searching for cities of gold that never existed. In 1540, Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado heard exciting stories about the 7 cities of gold somewhere north of Mexico. According to the rumors, these cities were so rich that even the walls of their buildings shimmered with gold. For men chasing glory and fortune, that kind of story was impossible to ignore. So Coronado set out with a massive expedition of soldiers, indigenous guides, and livestock, marching into lands that are now the southwestern United States. They crossed scorching deserts, vast grasslands, and territories that Europeans had never explored before. After months of hardship, they finally reached the first city. There was just one small problem. It wasn't a golden city at all. It was simply a village built from mud and stone with no gold anywhere. Coronado continued searching for years, but the legendary cities of gold turned out to exist only in people's imaginations. Story 23. The Niger Expedition, when mosquitoes beat an empire. In 1841, Britain launched a major expedition along the Niger River in Africa. The mission sounded noble: expand trade, spread civilization, and of course, prove that European technology could conquer any place on Earth. 3 modern steamships were carefully prepared, along with more than 100 European sailors and officers. They even designed special ventilation systems on the ships to prevent tropical diseases. The plan sounded very scientific and very confident. There was just one small detail they underestimated: mosquitoes. Not long after entering the Niger River, malaria began spreading through the expedition. One by one, people fell ill. Officers, sailors, scientists, no one was immune. Within a few months, most of the expedition had been defeated by the disease. Many died, and the survivors were forced to retreat. Sometimes in history, the true winner isn't an army, but a tiny mosquito. Story 24. The Basevich Expedition, when an army walked straight into a trap. In 1717, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia sent a force of about 4,000 soldiers to Central Asia. Their mission was to search for gold and establish relations with local kingdoms, especially the region of Khiva in the deserts of Central Asia. After a long journey through dry and brutal lands, the army finally arrived. Surprisingly, the ruler of Khiva appeared very friendly. He welcomed the Russian forces, invited them to rest, and said the city was ready to receive them as honored guests. There was just one small suggestion. He explained that such a large army would be difficult to supply with enough food, so it would be better if they split into several smaller groups and camped in different areas nearby. It sounded reasonable, if you forgot you were standing in a land full of intrigue. That very night, the forces of Khiva attacked each small group separately. The Russian army was almost completely destroyed. Story 25. The Titha Expedition, a ship frozen in the Arctic. In 1872, an Austro-Hungarian expedition boarded the ship Teeth with the goal of finding the Northeast Passage through the Arctic. Like many explorers of that era, they believed that if they pushed just a little farther north, they would discover a new route connecting Europe and Asia. But the Arctic had other plans. Only a few months after entering the icy waters, the ship became completely trapped in sea ice. And the worst part was that the ice never melted. The ship remained locked in place for months, then years, drifting slowly with the frozen currents. The crew could do little except wait, hunt seals to survive, and hope the ice would eventually release the ship. During that time, they even discovered a new archipelago that no one had known about before. In the end, after years of being trapped, they were forced to abandon the ship and drag their boats across the ice in search of a way to survive. Story 26. Mungo Park, the man who returned to hell a second time. In the late 18th century, Scottish explorer Mungo Park became famous after his first expedition to the Niger River in Africa. That journey had been brutally difficult. He was robbed, captured, and nearly died several times. But somehow he survived and returned to Britain as a hero. And that was when he made a decision many people considered unwise. He decided to go back. In 1805, Mungo Park led a new expedition with about 40 Europeans determined to explore the full course of the Niger River. But disease, malaria, and exhaustion quickly tore the expedition apart. One by one, men collapsed during the harsh journey. By the time they reached the Niger River, only 11 people were still alive. Park continued traveling down the river, but at a dangerous set of rapids, their boat was attacked and overturned. Mungo Park disappeared into the water. Story 27. The airship Italia, a North Pole flight that crashed on the ice. In 1928, Italian explorer Umberto Nobile led an expedition aboard the airship Italia to explore the Arctic. The massive airship flew across endless white ice and even passed directly over the North Pole, making the mission at first look like a major success. But on the journey back, Arctic weather suddenly turned violent. Strong winds and heavy ice caused the airship to lose control. Eventually, it crashed onto the thick sea ice in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Some crew members survived the crash and were stranded on the ice, while the remaining part of the airship drifted away into the sky with several crew members still aboard. The survivors set up a bright red tent on the ice and began sending distress signals. The rescue operation that followed became a massive international search effort. But while trying to save them, another legendary explorer would also disappear into the frozen Arctic. Story 28. Ludwig Leichhardt, the explorer who vanished in the Australian interior. In 1848, German explorer Ludwig Leichhardt set out on an ambitious journey to cross the Australian interior from east to west. At that time, this region was almost completely unknown to Europeans, filled with dry deserts, brutal climate, and enormous distances. Leichhardt led a small group with horses, cattle, and exploration equipment. At first, the expedition seemed normal. They left the last settlement behind and moved deeper into the wild interior of Australia. Then, no one ever saw them again. There was no final letter, no distress signal, no clear trace. Later search parties found only vague clues, stories from indigenous communities, and a few objects that might have belonged to the expedition, but no solid evidence of what truly happened. To this day, Ludwig Leichhardt remains one of the greatest disappearance mysteries in the history of Australian exploration. Story 29. The Mein Pasha Expedition, a rescue mission that killed hundreds. In 1886, the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley was given a mission that sounded heroic: travel deep into Africa to rescue Mein Pasha, a governor who was reportedly isolated by local rebellions. It sounded like a grand rescue operation, but the route Stanley chose led straight through the Congo rainforest, one of the most dangerous jungles on Earth. His expedition included more than 700 people, soldiers, porters, and local guides. Almost immediately, the journey turned into a nightmare. Disease, starvation, wild animals, and clashes with local groups slowly devastated the expedition. Hundreds of people never made it out of that forest. After years of hardship, Stanley finally reached Mein Pasha. There was just one ironic detail. Mein didn't actually need rescuing, so the expedition ended up costing hundreds of lives to rescue a man who was doing just fine. Story 30. Burton and Speke. When an expedition became a personal war. In 1857, two British explorers, Richard Burton and John Henning Speke, set out on a major expedition in East Africa. Their goal was to solve one of the greatest geographical mysteries of the time: find the source of the Nile River. At first they were teammates, but the journey quickly turned into a nightmare. Both men suffered from severe tropical diseases. At one point, Burton could barely walk, while Speke developed infections that temporarily robbed him of both hearing and sight. But the worst problem wasn't illness. The two explorers began to hate each other. When Speke discovered Lake Victoria and believed it was the source of the Nile, Burton strongly disagreed. What started as a scientific debate soon turned into a personal feud that lasted for years. They were preparing for a public debate that would decide who was right. But just before the debate took place, Speke died from a mysterious gunshot while out hunting. Story 31. The Bedrosian Desert, where nature defeated Alexander. In 325 BC, Alexander the Great had conquered nearly the entire world known to the Greeks. He won battle after battle and had almost never been defeated on the battlefield. But there was one place even Alexander could not defeat. It was the Bedrosian Desert, located in what is now parts of Iran and Pakistan. After his campaign in India, Alexander decided to lead his army across this brutal desert on the way back home. Part of the reason was strategic, and part of it was to prove he could succeed where previous armies had failed. The desert quickly proved otherwise. The daytime heat was scorching. The nights were freezing and water sources were almost non-existent. Soldiers died from thirst exhaustion and sudden desert floods. By the end of the march, the desert had killed more of Alexander's soldiers than any battle he had ever fought. After 31 stories, one thing becomes pretty clear. Humans always believe that with enough maps, enough courage, and a little confidence, we can conquer nature. But history usually responds in a very calm way. Sure, go ahead and try. From Arctic ice to burning deserts to oceans full of very annoyed whales, nature usually has its own plans. So now I'm curious, if you had to join one of these expeditions, which one would you choose? Write your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy strange history stories like these, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because trust me, history still has many crazier stories waiting.